I sat there on Christmas Eve, the cold flicker of the tree lights barely warming the chill inside me as my daughter-in-law laughed at my broken French. "Oh, Maman, you sound so funny," she sneered, her words cutting sharper than the icy December wind outside our tiny New York brownstone. I smiled through the hurt, pretending it didn't shatter the fragile dignity I'd worn for decades. "Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Marie, though everyone just calls me Grandma now. At 72, I thought I'd earned the right to be heard. Instead, I found myself invisible in my own family story. The morning light filtered through my cramped Brooklyn apartment windows, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floors. My fingers trembled as I folded the same dish towels over and over, a nervous habit I'd developed in recent years. The scent of burnt coffee filled the kitchen from the pot I'd forgotten on the burner again. My mind wandered too often these days, drifting between the present pain and memories of a life that once felt full of purpose. The leather armchair where I spent most evenings creaked under my weight, its once rich brown surface now cracked and faded like old photographs. I'd been checking my phone for 3 days straight. Christmas was approaching, and the silence from my family grew louder with each passing hour. My son Michael had promised to call about dinner plans. My daughter-in-law Catherine always made the arrangements, speaking in rapid French to her mother while I sat quietly, understanding every cruel word they thought I couldn't comprehend. The irony wasn't lost on me. Born in a small apartment above a boulangerie in Montmartre, I'd spent my first 18 years breathing in the warm, yeasty air of fresh bread and listening to my grandmère speak in the musical tones of Parisian French. But that life felt like another person's memories now, buried under decades of trying to fit into an American dream that never quite embraced me. I remember the day I first held my grandson Tommy in my arms. His tiny fingers wrapped around mine with such trust, such pure love. That was 7 years ago. Now, at 9, he barely looked up from his iPad when I visited. Catherine had trained him well to see me as an interruption rather than a treasure. My phone buzzed. Finally. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and my heart fluttered with desperate hope. "Mom, sorry, change of plans. Catherine's family is coming from Montreal. We won't have room this year." The words hit me like a physical blow. No room. In the house I'd helped them buy with my life savings from the bakery. No room for the woman who'd worked 16-hour days so her son could attend Columbia University. No room for the grandmother who'd babied Tommy through his first fever, his first heartbreak over a playground crush. "But Michael," I whispered, hating how weak my voice sounded. "I already bought the gifts. I made your favorite cookies, the ones with dash and Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long time, watching my reflection in its black screen. When had I become so small? So easily dismissed? The woman staring back at me looked tired, defeated. Her silver hair hung limp around a face marked by years of swallowing disappointment. But there was something else in that reflection, something I hadn't seen in years. A flicker of the girl who once ran through Parisian streets, who learned English by memorizing song lyrics, who packed everything she owned into 2 suitcases and crossed an ocean for love. That girl was still there, buried but breathing. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I walked to the corner bakery, the one owned by the young Syrian family who always smiled when I ordered my morning coffee. The familiar scent of rising dough wrapped around me like an old friend's embrace. "Bonjour, Madame Marie," called Hassan, the owner's son. He was maybe 25, with kind eyes that reminded me of Michael at that age. Before life hardened him. Before Catherine convinced him that loving his mother was somehow shameful. "Bonjour, Hassan," I replied, the French rolling off my tongue like silk. His eyes widened. "Your accent, it's perfect. Are you from France?" For the first time in years, someone was genuinely interested in my story. Not dismissed. Not mocked. Just curious. "Paris," I said softly. "Born and raised on croissants," as my grandmère used to say. We talked for an hour. About Paris, about baking, about the way bread could heal hearts as well as feed bodies. Hassan's father, Omar, joined us, sharing stories of Damascus and the bakery they'd left behind. These strangers welcomed my memories when my own family couldn't spare 5 minutes for my presence. Walking home, I felt lighter somehow. For 1 hour, I had been Marie from Montmartre, not just Michael's inconvenient mother. But the feeling faded as I climbed the 3 flights to my apartment. The walls seemed smaller than before, pressing in with decades of accumulated loneliness. I opened the box where I kept my most treasured possessions. Photos of my parents, my grandmère, the bakery where I learned to turn flour and water into miracles. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper yellow with age, was my grandmère's rolling pin. She'd given it to me the day I left for America, her weathered hands shaking as she pressed it into mine. "Wherever you go, ma petite," she'd whispered, "remember who you are. Ide furgutin." Somewhere between trying to fit in, between swallowing insults disguised as jokes, between making myself smaller and smaller to accommodate everyone else's comfort, I'd lost myself entirely. That night, I called my sister in Phoenix. We hadn't spoken in months, both of us too proud to admit how isolated we'd become. "Marie? Is everything okay?" The concern in her voice broke something loose inside me. "And, do you ever feel like you're disappearing?" "Every damn day," she laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "My kids think I'm just a convenient babysitter. My son-in-law calls me Grandmother What's-Her-Face in English but thinks I don't understand." We talked until dawn. About the sacrifices we'd made, the respect we'd never received, the way our children had learned to take our love for granted while withholding their own. "What are we going to do about it?" and asked as the sun painted Brooklyn's skyline pink and gold. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But something has to change." The next few days passed in a blur of small revelations. I noticed how Catherine rolled her eyes when I spoke, how Michael changed the subject whenever I mentioned feeling left out, how Tommy had been taught not to hug me too long or too tight. I remembered the Christmas 3 years ago when Catherine had made a joke about my peasant food in front of their friends. How she'd laughed when I'd brought homemade coco vin to their dinner party, dismissing it as too ethnic for their sophisticated guests. Too ethnic. As if my heritage was something shameful. As if the culture that had given me strength, beauty, and resilience was somehow lesser than her Montreal pretensions. But the breaking point came during a family video call on December 20th. "Marie," Catherine said, not even looking at the camera, "we need you to watch Tommy this weekend. We're going to that new French restaurant in Manhattan." The irony was razor sharp. They'd go pay $100 for some chef's interpretation of French cuisine while treating the woman who'd grown up eating the real thing like an unpaid servant. "Catherine," I said carefully, "I've made plans." It was a lie. My only plan was to reorganize my spice cabinet and maybe watch some old movies. But for once in my life, I wanted to see what would happen if I said no. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up. "Plans? What kind of plans?" The dismissive tone was nothing new, but this time I felt it differently. This time, instead of shrinking, I straightened. "Personal plans," I replied calmly. "Mom, just cancel whatever it is," Michael jumped in. "We really need this night out." Need. They needed their freedom, their romance, their expensive meal. But they never seemed to need my company, my stories, my love freely given. That's when Catherine made her fatal mistake. She started speaking in French to Michael, rapid-fire complaints about how difficult I was becoming, how I was getting too demanding in my old age. "Elle devient vraiment pénible," she said. "She's becoming really annoying. Et ces histoires de Paris, qui s'en soucie vraiment? And her Paris stories? Who really cares?" She switched back to English with a fake smile. "Sorry, Marie. Michael and I were just discussing logistics." My heart pounded, but not with the familiar pain of being excluded. This time, it was anger. Pure, clarifying rage. "Je comprends parfaitement ce que vous dites," he said quietly. I understand perfectly what you're saying. The color drained from Catherine's face. "Et je sais exactement ce que vous pensez de moi depuis des années." And I know exactly what you think of me, and have for years. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. "Mom," Michael started, but I held up my hand. "Catherine," I continued in English, my voice steady as stone, "you have spent years mocking my heritage, dismissing my stories, and treating me like free childcare while speaking French in front of me like I'm some ignorant immigrant who doesn't understand." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "But here's what you never bothered to learn, ma chère belle-fille. I was born in Paris. I grew up speaking French before I ever learned English. Every cruel thing you've said, every snide comment, every time you've laughed at my expense. I understood it all." Michael's face crumpled. "Mom, I had no idea oh, you had an idea," I interrupted. "You've been letting your wife disrespect your mother for years because it was easier than standing up to her. Because defending me might have made your life uncomfortable." The truth hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I looked at Tommy, my sweet grandson, watching this adult drama unfold with wide eyes. "Tommy," I said gently, switching back to English for his benefit, "your grandmère loves you more than all the stars in the sky. Don't ever let anyone tell you that your family history is something to be ashamed of. You come from a long line of bakers, dreamers, and brave people who crossed oceans for love." I ended the call. My hands shook as I set down the phone, but not with fear. With liberation. For the first time in years, I'd told the truth. The whole truth. And the sky hadn't fallen. That night, I pulled out my grandmère's recipes. Real French recipes, written in her careful script, stained with decades of love and butter and joy. I hadn't made pain au chocolate in 10 years, too afraid Catherine would mock them as trying too hard to be fancy. But I made them now. I made them until my small kitchen smelled like heaven, like childhood, like home. The next morning, I knocked on Mrs. Rodriguez's door. She was my neighbor, a widow like me, who'd always been kind but kept to herself. Marie, she seemed surprised to see me holding a plate of warm pastries. I wanted to share, I said simply. And maybe? Talk. Her weathered face broke into the most beautiful smile. I was just making coffee. Please, come in. We sat at her small kitchen table, and I told her everything. About Paris, about the bakery, about the years of swallowing insults and pretending they didn't cut deep. Mija, she said, using the Spanish endearment that somehow felt warmer than anything my own family had called me in years, you've been carrying this alone for too long. That afternoon, she insisted we walk to the community center. There was a senior group that met every Tuesday, she said. People our age who understood what it meant to be overlooked by the world. I almost said no. Almost retreated back into my familiar isolation. But something in Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes, something that looked like hope, made me nod instead. The community center was nothing fancy. Fluorescent lights, folding chairs, coffee that tasted like dishwater. But the faces around the circle were kind. Weathered by life but not defeated by it. Welcome, said the group leader, a man named Frank who must have been pushing 80 but moved with surprising energy. We're sharing stories today about the things we're proud of but never get to talk about. One by one, they went around the circle. A woman named Betty had been a jazz singer in Harlem in the 60s. Robert had been a translator for the United Nations. Sarah had run a bookstore that helped launch 3 famous authors' careers. When it was my turn, my throat felt tight. I'm Marie, I started. I grew up in a bakery in Paris. My grandmère taught me to make bread that could make people cry with happiness. The words came slowly at first, then faster. I told them about the morning ritual of preparation, the way the dough felt alive under my hands, the satisfaction of feeding people something made with love. I haven't baked properly in years, I admitted. My family, they don't really value that kind of thing anymore. Frank leaned forward. Marie, would you be willing to teach us? We've been looking for someone to lead a cooking class. The offer stunned me. Someone wanted to learn from me? Someone valued what I had to offer? Yes, I whispered. Yes, I would love that. Driving home on the bus, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Purpose. The feeling that tomorrow might actually be better than today. But that evening, my phone rang. Michael's name flashed on the screen, and despite everything, my heart still hoped. Mom, Catherine wants to apologize. The words I'd waited years to hear. But something about his tone made me wary. She feels terrible about the misunderstanding, he continued. Misunderstanding. That's what they were calling years of deliberate cruelty now. She wants to invite you to Christmas dinner. A proper invitation this time. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar tug of desperate hope warring with hard-won wisdom. What does Catherine want to say to me directly? I asked. A pause. Well, she's a little emotional right now. But she asked me to tell you no, I interrupted gently. If Catherine wants to apologize, she can call me herself. I'm not accepting second-hand apologies anymore, Michael. Another pause, longer this time. Mom, you're being really difficult about this. There it was. The subtle shift back to making me the problem. Not Catherine's years of disrespect. Not Michael's failure to defend his mother. My difficulty in accepting scraps disguised as reconciliation. I'm being clear about what I need, I corrected. There's a difference. I hung up before he could argue. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened a bottle of wine. Nothing fancy, just a red blend from the corner store. But I poured it into my best crystal glass, the one my mother had brought from France, and I toasted myself. To Marie-Claire Dubois, I said aloud to my empty apartment. To the girl who crossed an ocean for love. To the woman who built a life with her own hands. To the grandmère who deserves better. The wine tasted like courage. The next few days were strangely peaceful. No anxious checking of my phone. No rehearsing conversations that would never go the way I hoped. No shrinking myself to fit into spaces where I clearly wasn't wanted. Instead, I planned my first baking lesson for the senior group. I wrote out shopping lists, practiced explanations in English, picked simple recipes that would give everyone a sense of accomplishment. On Christmas Eve morning, as I needed dough for the pain de mie I'd teach next week, my phone rang again. This time it was Catherine. Marie, her voice was carefully controlled, I think we need to talk. I agree, I said calmly, not stopping my kneading rhythm. I want you to know that I never meant to hurt your feelings. If I said things that seemed insensitive, it wasn't intentional. If I said things seemed insensitive. The non-apology was textbook manipulation, designed to make me grateful for crumbs while taking no real responsibility. Catherine, I said, I need you to understand something. I heard every word you said about me in French. For years. Every joke about my cooking, every comment about my stories being boring, every time you called me the old peasant to your mother. Silence. I need a real apology. Not an if I hurt your feelings apology. A recognition that you deliberately chose to be cruel to someone who only wanted to love your family. You were eavesdropping on private conversations, she shot back, her composure cracking. I was existing in my son's house while you chose to mock me in a language you assumed I didn't understand. That's not eavesdropping, Catherine. That's living while bilingual. More silence. Marie, I think you're blowing this out of proportion. We're family. We should be able to move past this. Family, I repeated slowly. Yes, let's talk about family. Family doesn't mock each other's heritage. Family doesn't exclude grandmothers from Christmas. Family doesn't treat free childcare as an obligation while offering no respect in return. You're being overdramatic, and you're being exactly who you've always been, I interrupted. The difference is, I'm not pretending not to see it anymore. I hung up. My hands were shaking, but not with fear. With adrenaline. With the rush of finally speaking truth after years of swallowing lies. 10 minutes later, Michael called. Mom, Catherine's crying. She says you were horrible to her. The speed with which she'd run to him, twisting the narrative to make herself the victim, would have been impressive if it weren't so predictable. Michael, I said slowly, I spoke to your wife with the same respect she's shown me for years. If she found that horrible, perhaps she should examine her own behavior. She's trying to include you in Christmas after years of excluding me. One invitation doesn't erase the pattern. And it certainly doesn't excuse the cruelty. Mom, please. She made a mistake. Can't you forgive her? There it was. The expectation that had defined our relationship for decades. That I would absorb the hurt, swallow the insult, pretend the wound hadn't been inflicted for the sake of keeping everyone else comfortable. I spent 30 years forgiving without ever receiving an apology, I said quietly. I spent 3 decades making myself smaller so everyone else could be more comfortable. I'm done shrinking, Michael. The question isn't whether I can forgive her. The question is whether you can respect me. Of course I respect you, then prove it. Stop asking me to accept behavior you would never tolerate from anyone else. Stop making my pain secondary to her comfort. The line was quiet for a long moment. I don't know what you want from me, he finally said, and for the first time, he sounded lost rather than defensive. I want you to see me, I whispered. I want you to remember that I'm not just a role in your life. I'm a person with feelings, with dignity, with a right to be treated kindly by the people I love. Mom, I want you to remember that before I was your mother, I was Marie. I had dreams, adventures, a whole life full of stories worth hearing. I want you to be curious about who I am, not just what I can do for you. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of unspoken hurt. I love you, Michael, I continued. I will always love you. But I won't continue to accept scraps and call them love anymore. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the scent of rising bread and realized something profound had shifted. The desperate ache for their approval, the constant anxiety about their rejection, it was gone. In its place was something I hadn't felt in years, self-respect. Christmas Eve arrived gray and cold, typical for Brooklyn in December. I'd planned a quiet day. Some movies, maybe a video call with and definitely some of the pain of chocolate I'd made for myself. The knock on my door at noon was unexpected. I opened it to find Tommy standing in the hallway, holding a drawing and looking uncertain. Hi, grandmère, he said quietly. My heart clenched. He was using the French word for grandmother, something Catherine had always discouraged. Hello, mon petit-fils, I replied, crouching to his level. What beautiful artwork do you have there? He held up a drawing of 2 figures standing outside what looked like the Eiffel Tower. One small, one taller with silver hair. It's you and me in Paris, he said shyly. Mom said you grew up there. I want to visit someday. Tears stung my eyes. Tommy, this is the most beautiful gift I've ever received. I'm sorry about Christmas, he said, his 9-year-old voice heavy with adult concerns no child should carry. I told Mom and Dad I wanted to have dinner with you, but they said it was complicated. I knelt fully, looking into eyes that held Michael's curiosity and kindness, unmarked yet by his parents' cynicism. Tommy, listen to me very carefully. Adults sometimes make decisions that hurt people they love, not because they're bad people, but because they're scared or confused or proud. What matters is that you have a kind heart. Don't ever let anyone make you ashamed of loving your grandmère. I won't, he promised solemnly. And Tommy? Someday, when you're older, I will take you to Paris. We'll see the Eiffel Tower, eat real croissants, and I'll show you the bakery where I learned to make magic with flour and butter. His eyes lit up. Really? Really? That's a promise from grandmère to grandson. He hugged me tight, this little boy who somehow understood that love doesn't require taking sides, that kindness is always a choice. After he left, his father having called 3 times to hurry him up, I sat with his drawing propped against my salt shaker, looking at his vision of our future together. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely hopeful about tomorrow. That evening, as Christmas Eve settled over Brooklyn like a soft blanket, I did something radical. I got dressed up. Not for anyone else, but for me. I put on the emerald dress I'd bought years ago but never worn because Catherine had called the color too young for me. I styled my silver hair, applied lipstick the shade of ripe cherries, and looked in the mirror. The woman looking back was familiar but transformed. Still 72, still weathered by life's storms, but no longer apologetic for taking up space. I walked to Hassan's bakery, where the young man had left a light on despite being closed for the holiday. "Madame Marie," he called through the glass door, hurrying to unlock it. "What are you doing out on Christmas Eve?" "Living," I said simply, and meant it. We sat in his warm kitchen, sharing stories and fresh bread while snow began to dust the windows. He told me about Damascus, about the spice markets and the call to prayer echoing off ancient stones. I told him about Montmartre, about my grandmere's hands teaching mine the sacred alchemy of baking. "You know," Hassan said thoughtfully, "my father wants to add French pastries to our menu. But we don't know how to make them properly." A seed of an idea planted itself in my mind. "Hassan," I said slowly, "what would you think about a partnership? I teach you the pastries, help you perfect the recipes, and maybe, work with you a few days a week." His face lit up like Christmas morning. "Are you serious? That would be incredible. But are you sure? Don't you want to enjoy retirement?" I laughed, surprising myself with how genuine it sounded. "Honey, I've been retired from living for too long. I think it's time to get back to work." Walking home through the gentle snowfall, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: excitement about the future. The next few weeks passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Hassan's father, Omar, welcomed me into their kitchen family with open arms. We spent hours perfecting croissant technique, adjusting recipes for American ovens, designing a pastry case that would do justice to both traditions. My baking classes at the senior center grew from 6 people to 20. Frank started calling me Professor Marie, and I didn't have the heart to correct him. Betty, the former jazz singer, said my pain of chocolate made her remember why she'd fallen in love with New York in the first place. "You've got magic in those hands, honey," she told me after a particularly successful lesson. "Don't you ever let anyone convince you otherwise." The phone calls from Michael became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Part of me mourned the silence, but a larger part felt relieved. No more walking on eggshells. No more translating my needs into requests small enough not to threaten anyone. And visited in February, flying in from Phoenix for the first time in 5 years. She took one look at me and started crying. "Marie, you look alive," she said through her tears. "I haven't seen you look this happy since before Papa died." We spent a week rediscovering each other. Not as the sisters who called to complain about ungrateful children, but as women with rich histories, hard-won wisdom, and futures still worth imagining. "I'm thinking about moving back east," she admitted on her last day. "Maybe Brooklyn. There's something here, something that feels like possibility again." The idea of having in close, of rebuilding the sister bond we'd let atrophy under the weight of family obligations, made my heart sing. But the real test came in March, on Tommy's 10th birthday. I'd sent a card and a small gift, a children's book about Paris I'd found at the local bookstore. I didn't expect acknowledgement, but the phone rang that evening. "Grand-mère?" Tommy's voice was quiet, conspiratorial. "Mon petit-fils. How was your birthday?" "Good. I got your book. I've been reading it every night. Did you really live near the Mona Lisa?" I laughed. "Not exactly, sweetheart, but I did visit her many times at the Louvre. I want to see her too, someday." "And you will," I promised. "That trip to Paris is still waiting for us." "Grandmere," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "I miss you. Mom and Dad say you're too busy to visit anymore, but I don't think that's the real reason." My heart clenched. This wise little boy saw more than his parents gave him credit for. "Tommy, I love you more than all the stars in the sky. That will never change, no matter what happens with the adults. But sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices to protect their hearts." "Are you protecting your heart from us?" The question, asked with such innocent directness, nearly broke me. "I'm protecting my heart from people who don't treat it kindly," I said carefully. "But never from you, mon chéri. Never from you. When I grow up," he declared with fierce determination, "I'm going to treat everyone's heart kindly." "Yes," I whispered through my tears. "Yes, you will." After that conversation, I found myself oddly at peace with the situation. Tommy would grow up knowing he was loved unconditionally by his grandmere. And someday, when he was old enough to understand, he would make his own choices about the kind of relationships he wanted to cultivate. Spring arrived late but dramatic in Brooklyn. One day the trees were bare, the next they exploded in pink and white blossoms that made even the grimiest street corner look hopeful. The bakery partnership with Hassan's family was exceeding all expectations. Our French pastry section had developed a following, with people coming from Manhattan just to taste authentic pain au chocolate made by someone who'd learned the craft in Paris. Madame Marie, Omar said one busy Saturday morning as we watched customers line up for our croissants, you have brought blessing to our family business. The word family no longer stung. This chosen family, built on mutual respect and shared passion, felt more nurturing than blood relations that demanded everything while offering nothing in return. My senior center classes had evolved into something resembling a small catering business. We'd been asked to provide desserts for 3 different community events, and the money we earned went into a fund for group activities. We should take a trip, Betty suggested during one of our Tuesday meetings. Somewhere none of us has been before. Where would you want to go? I asked, curious. Paris, said Robert, the former UN translator. I'd love to see it through the eyes of someone who really knows it. The idea took root quickly. 6 of us, all over 65, planning an adventure to France like teenagers scheming about summer vacation. Frank started researching group rates. Sarah began learning basic French phrases. Betty declared she was going to sing in a Parisian cafe before she died. Marie, Frank said after we'd spent an hour poring over guidebooks, would you really be willing to show us your Paris? I looked around the circle at these faces that had become dear to me, these people who valued my stories and respected my knowledge, who saw me as a resource rather than a burden. I would love nothing more, I said honestly. That night, I called him with the news. You're going to Paris with a senior tour group you organized yourself? She laughed. Marie, you've turned into some kind of adventurer. I've turned into myself, I corrected. For the first time in decades, I'm just being myself. And Michael? Catherine? Have they reached out? I paused, looking out my window at the spring evening settling over Brooklyn. No, I said finally. And that's okay. I spent so many years waiting for them to see my worth. Now I'm too busy living it to worry about their approval. It was true. The constant ache of rejection had faded to a distant sadness, like mourning someone who was still alive but had chosen to remain a stranger. Summer brought unexpected developments. Hassan's eldest daughter, Layla, started helping in the bakery during her college break. She was studying business and marketing, full of ideas about expanding our reach through social media and online ordering. Tata Marie, she called me, using the Arabic word for grandmother, you're Instagram famous. She showed me her phone, where pictures of our pastries had garnered hundreds of likes and dozens of comments from people wanting to know where they could find authentic French pastry in Brooklyn. I don't understand social media, I admitted, but I understand people wanting good food made with love. That's exactly the point, Layla said excitedly. It's not about the technology. It's about the story. And your story is incredible. She was right. Somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I'd become the protagonist of my own life again instead of a supporting character in everyone else's drama. The Paris trip was scheduled for September, and as summer wound down, I found myself more excited than nervous. I'd been practicing my French with Hassan's mother, who spoke it fluently from her Lebanese education. The language came back like muscle memory, each conversation bringing more confidence. You know, Hassan's mother told me one afternoon as we shared mint tea, you seem younger every time I see you. Not in your face, that shows your wisdom. But in your spirit. That is blooming again. She was right. I felt more like myself at 73 than I had at 63. But life, as always, had one more surprise waiting. It was a Thursday evening in August when my phone rang with Michael's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Mom? His voice sounded strange, tight. Hello, Michael. Can we talk? In person, I mean. I have something I need to tell you. My first instinct was to say no, to protect the peace I'd built. But something in his tone made me pause. What about, Michael? Catherine and I are getting divorced. The words hit me with unexpected force, not because I was surprised, but because I realized I felt nothing like vindication. Just sadness for all the wasted years, all the opportunities for joy that had been sacrificed to pride and stubbornness. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and meant it. Can I come over? There are things I need to say. Things I should have said years ago. I almost said no. Almost told him it was too late for apologies, that I'd moved beyond needing his validation. But then I thought about Tommy, about the man I wanted his father to become. All right, I said. But Michael, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago. I won't accept blame for other people's choices, and I won't pretend the hurt didn't happen to make anyone more comfortable. I know, he said quietly. I'm counting on it. He arrived an hour later, looking older than his 38 years. The confidence that had always defined him seemed shaken, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. Your apartment looks different, he said, glancing around. It did look different. Brighter. I'd painted the walls a warm cream color, hung some of my photographs from the senior center trips, displayed Tommy's drawing prominently on the refrigerator. "I've been making changes," I said simply, not offering to make him coffee or fuss over his comfort the way I once would have. We sat across from each other at my small kitchen table, and for the first time in years, he really looked at me. Not through me or past me, but at me. "Mom," he started, then stopped, seeming to gather courage. "I've been seeing a therapist. Since the separation started. And we've talked a lot about how I treated you." I waited, not filling the silence the way I used to. "Catherine told me some things. About what she said to you in French. About how she talked about you to her family." His voice cracked. "Mom, I'm so ashamed." "Of her behavior?" I asked. "Of mine," he said firmly. "Of letting it happen. Of choosing not to see what was right in front of me because it was easier to let her make you the problem than to deal with the real issues in our marriage." This was not what I'd expected. I'd braced myself for manipulation, for blame disguised as reconciliation. Instead, he seemed genuinely broken by his own actions. "Michael," I said carefully, "I appreciate you saying that. But I need you to understand that this isn't about Catherine. This is about you choosing, again and again, to let someone disrespect your mother rather than having difficult conversations." "I know." His voice was barely a whisper. "I know, and I hate myself for it." "I don't want you to hate yourself," I said, surprised by my own compassion. "I want you to understand that I'm a person who deserves respect, just like anyone else. I want you to remember that I had a whole life before you were born, and I have a whole life now that doesn't revolve around your needs." He looked up then, really seeing me perhaps for the first time in years. "Tell me about your life now," he said. "Please." So I did. I told him about the bakery, about my senior center friends, about the Paris trip we were planning. I told him about feeling useful and valued and seen for the first time in decades. "You're glowing," he said wonderfully. "I haven't seen you look this happy since I was a kid." "I'm living for myself now instead of waiting for other people to decide I'm worth their time," I explained. We talked for 2 hours. Really talked, perhaps for the first time since he'd become an adult. He told me about his unhappiness, about how he'd convinced himself that keeping peace with Catherine was more important than anything else, about how he'd gradually isolated himself from everyone who might have challenged that choice. "I want to make things right," he said as the evening wound down. "I don't know how, but I want to try." "Michael," I said gently, "you can't make the past right. You can only choose to be better going forward." "How? What do I need to do?" "You need to see me," I said simply. "Not as a function or a service or a problem to manage. As a person with her own interests, her own friendships, her own dreams. You need to be genuinely curious about who I am, not just what I can do for you. And if I do that, if I really change, would you consider letting me back into your life?" The question hung between us, heavy with years of accumulated hurt and tentative hope. "Michael," I said slowly, "my life isn't on hold waiting for you to figure out how to love me properly. I have plans, commitments, relationships that matter to me. If you want to be part of my life, you need to fit into the life I'm actually living, not the one where I exist primarily to serve your family's convenience." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I understand. And it needs to be genuine. Not guilt, not obligation. Real curiosity about who your mother is as a person. Tell me something about yourself I don't know," he said immediately. I smiled, thinking of all the stories I'd stopped sharing because no one seemed interested. "I once spent a night in the Louvre," I said. His eyes widened. "What? How?" "I was 19, working as an au pair for a family connected to the museum. There was a gala that ran very late, and by the time we finished cleaning up, the metros had stopped running. The security guard let me sleep in the staff room, and at dawn, before the museum opened, I walked through the galleries alone. Just you and the Mona Lisa? Just me and centuries of human creativity. I sat on a bench in front of the Venus de Milo and promised myself that no matter where life took me, I would never stop believing in beauty." "That's incredible, Mom. I can't believe I never knew that story." "You never asked," I said gently, without accusation. We parted that night with a tentative plan to have lunch the following week. No grand gestures, no dramatic reconciliations. Just two people agreeing to try to know each other better. As I got ready for bed, I realized something had shifted inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but something softer. A willingness to see if genuine change was possible without compromising the self-respect I'd fought so hard to reclaim. The Paris trip exceeded every expectation I dared to have. 6 seniors from Brooklyn, wide-eyed and determined to squeeze every drop of joy from our adventure. Walking through Montmartre with Frank, Betty, Sarah, Robert, and Jim, I felt decades melt away. They were enchanted by everything I'd taken for granted as a child: the narrow cobblestone streets, the artists sketching tourists, the cafe where I'd had my first coffee. "Marie," Betty said as we stood outside the building where I'd grown up, "you can see yourself as a little girl here, can't you?" I could. 5-year-old Marie running up these same stairs, flour in her hair from helping Grandmere in the bakery below. I can see all of us, I said, looking around at my chosen family. Past and present and future, all mixed together. Betty sang La Vie en Rose in a cafe on the left bank, and the French patrons applauded like she was Edith Piaf herself. Robert struck up conversations with strangers in his rusty but enthusiastic French. Sarah bought enough books to require an extra suitcase. But the most meaningful moment came on our last day, when I took them to the cemetery where my Grandmere was buried. Thank you, I whispered to her gravestone in French, for teaching me that I was worth more than I was settling for. Flying back to New York, I felt complete in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood. I had reclaimed my heritage, shared my stories, been valued for exactly who I was. Michael was waiting at the airport. It was a surprise that could have felt like an intrusion, but his face when he saw me, genuine joy, not obligation, made it feel like a gift instead. How was it? He asked as my friends gathered their luggage. Perfect, I said simply. Mom, he said, then stopped, seeming to change his mind about what he wanted to say. I'm proud of you. The words I'd waited decades to hear. But hearing them now, when I no longer needed them for validation, they felt different. Like recognition rather than rescue. Thank you, I said, and introduced him to Frank, Betty, and the others. He spent 20 minutes listening to their stories about our trip, asking genuine questions, laughing at Betty's impression of a snooty Parisian waiter. Your mother, Frank told Michael, is a national treasure. We learned more about life from her in 1 week than most people learn in a year. Watching Michael's face as he heard other people value me, I saw something click into place. Understanding, maybe. Or just the beginning of it. The months that followed weren't perfect, but they were real. Michael called every Sunday, not to ask for anything, but to hear about my week. He started bringing Tommy to visit on Saturday afternoons, not asking me to babysit but just spending time together. Catherine, perhaps predictably, tried to turn Tommy against me during their custody negotiations, telling him lies about why Grandmere didn't come to family events anymore. But Tommy, wise beyond his 10 years, simply said, I love Grandmere and she loves me. That's all I need to know. The divorce was finalized in November. Michael got joint custody of Tommy, and the first thing he did was ask if Tommy could spend Thanksgiving with me. Are you sure? I asked. That's a big holiday for a child. Mom, he said, I want my son to grow up knowing that holidays are about gratitude and love, not obligation and performance. I can't think of anyone better to teach him that than you. So Tommy and I spent Thanksgiving cooking together in my small kitchen, making techniques passed down from my Grandmere while he told me about school, friends, his dreams of becoming an artist someday. Grandmere, he said as we waited for the bread to rise, are you happy now? The question, asked with characteristic directness, made me pause. Yes, I said, surprising myself with how quickly and certainly the answer came. Yes, mon chéri, I am. Good, he said solemnly. Everyone should be happy. That Christmas was different from any I'd had in years. Not because my family suddenly became perfect, but because I was no longer waiting for them to grant me permission to enjoy my life. Michael and Tommy came for Christmas Eve dinner, bringing flowers and wine and genuine curiosity about the French traditions I wanted to share. We made bûche de Noël together, laughed at Michael's clumsy attempts to roll the delicate cake, told stories about Christmas in Paris. I'm sorry it took me so long to see you, Michael said as we cleaned up afterwards. I'm sorry I waited so long to insist on being seen, I replied. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore, or even reconciliation. It was about two adults choosing to build something new from the foundation of what had survived. And moved to Brooklyn in January, finding a small apartment 6 blocks from mine. Having my sister close, having someone who remembered our childhood in Paris and understood the journey we'd both taken, felt like recovering a piece of myself I'd thought lost forever. The bakery continued to flourish. Hassan's whole family had essentially adopted me, including me in their celebrations, asking my advice about everything from business decisions to recipes to teenage drama. You know, Hassan said one spring morning as we prepared the day's pastries, you've changed our whole family's idea of what it means to grow older. How so? Before you, we thought getting older meant becoming invisible, irrelevant. But watching you, you got more yourself as you got older, not less. He was right, I realized. At 74, I was more Marie-Claire Dubois than I'd been since I was 20. The senior center group decided to make the Paris trip an annual tradition. This year, we were planning to visit Provence, and 3 new people had asked to join us. You're like the Pied Piper of senior adventures, Betty teased during our planning meeting. I'm just someone who refused to act old, I replied. That summer, Tommy spent 2 weeks with me, a real visit rather than the obligation-laden encounters we'd had before. We cooked together, visited museums, explored Brooklyn neighborhoods I'd never bothered to discover during my years of waiting by the phone for invitations that rarely came. Grandmère, he said one evening as we watched the sunset from the promenade, I want to learn French. Real French, not just bonjour and merci. Of course, mon chéri. We'll start tomorrow. And when I'm older, will you really take me to Paris? To see where you grew up? Tommy, I said, watching the light dance off the water, we'll go whenever you're ready. That's a promise from grandmère to grandson, and I always keep my promises. He leaned against me, this boy who was growing up knowing he was unconditionally loved, who would never have to choose between being himself and being accepted. I love you, grandmère. Je t'aime aussi, mon petit-fils. More than all the stars in the sky. As I write this, it's been 3 years since that Christmas Eve when Catherine mocked my French, thinking I wouldn't understand. 3 years since I stopped pretending not to see the disrespect, stopped accepting scraps and calling them love. My life now bears no resemblance to the lonely, anxious existence I'd accepted as normal. I wake up excited about the day ahead, knowing I have work that matters, relationships that nurture me, plans that bring joy. The bakery has become a neighborhood institution. My senior center classes have evolved into a small business that supplements my retirement income while giving me purpose. And I have coffee every Tuesday morning, sharing stories and dreams like the sisters we were before life pulled us in different directions. Michael and I have built something new together, based on mutual respect rather than obligation. It's not the relationship I once thought I wanted, but it's infinitely better than the painful dance of rejection and desperate hope we'd sustained for years. Tommy is 11 now, conversational in French, passionate about art, secure in the knowledge that his grandmère sees and values him exactly as he is. He's planning to spend next summer in Paris with me, seeing through his own eyes the places that shaped the woman who loves him unconditionally. I still live in the same small Brooklyn apartment, but it feels spacious now. Sunlight streams through windows I keep open. Photos of friends and adventures line the walls. The air smells of rising bread and possibility. The mirror reflects a woman I recognize but haven't seen in decades. Silver-haired but not diminished. Lined by experience but not defeated by it, present in her own life rather than waiting for permission to live it. I think about that Christmas Eve often, when Catherine's cruelty finally pushed me beyond my breaking point. At the time, it felt like the worst thing that could happen. Now I see it as the gift that saved my life. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves is to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. Sometimes refusing to shrink is the most radical act of self-care we can perform. I spent decades believing that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my dignity. I confused love with convenience, thought sacrifice always meant self-erasure. But love without respect isn't love at all. And sacrifice without appreciation is just sacrifice. Now, at 74, I know something I wish I'd understood at 50, I am not a supporting character in other people's stories. I am the protagonist of my own life, and that life is worth living fully, boldly, joyfully. Every morning, I make myself coffee in my grandmother's china cup and toast another day of being exactly who I am. Every evening, I fall asleep grateful for the courage to claim the respect I'd always deserved but had forgotten to demand. The girl who once promised herself she'd never stop believing in beauty kept her word, even when it took 7 decades to remember how to see her own worth as part of that beauty. I am Marie-Claire Dubois. I was born and raised on Croissants. I crossed an ocean for love and learned to bake miracles with my own hands. I am a mother, a grandmother, a teacher, a friend. I have stories worth hearing and wisdom worth sharing. And finally, at 74 years old, I know exactly who I am. The beauty of reclaiming yourself later in life is that you're no longer afraid of losing what never truly belonged to you. When I finally stood up for myself that Christmas Eve, I thought I was risking everything. Instead, I discovered I had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The weeks following the confrontation brought unexpected gifts. My neighbors, who had only known me as the quiet old lady in 3B, began to see me differently. Mrs. Rodriguez introduced me to her daughter as the French baker who know how to live. The mail carrier started asking about my pastries. The teenager who lived upstairs began nodding hello instead of looking through me. It was as if standing up to Catherine had somehow made me more visible to everyone else. Or maybe I was just finally allowing myself to be seen. One afternoon in late January, as I was teaching my Thursday baking class at the community center, a woman I didn't recognize slipped into the back of the room. She was maybe 50, well-dressed, with tired eyes that reminded me of my own just a year earlier. After class, she approached hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm Linda. I heard about your classes from my mother's neighbor. She said you were inspiring." I laughed. "I'm just someone who learned to make bread, dear." "No," she said firmly. "It's not that. My mother, she's been living with me for 3 years since my father died. And she's been so diminished. Apologetic. Always asking if she's in the way. But after she started coming here, she's different. She stands straighter. She laughs. Yesterday she told my teenage daughter a story about the Great Depression that had us all mesmerized. My throat tightened. What's your mother's name? Betty Morrison. The jazz singer? Betty, I exclaimed. She's wonderful. Did you know she once shared a stage with Billie Holiday? Linda's eyes filled with tears. She never told us that. She never talked about her singing career at all. We thought she'd just been a housewife. Oh honey, I said gently. Your mother was never just anything. She was a force of nature who happened to also be a housewife. There's a difference. We talked for another hour. About Betty, about the way women of our generation had been taught to minimize ourselves, about how easy it was for families to see only what they expected to see. How do you do it? Linda asked as we prepared to leave. How do you help them remember who they are? I thought about it. I don't help them remember. I just refuse to pretend that who they were doesn't matter. When someone tells me about surviving the depression or raising 5 children alone or building a business from nothing, I listen like it's the most fascinating story I've ever heard. Because it is. But how did you learn to value yourself that way? I got tired of waiting for permission to matter, I said simply. One day I realized that if I didn't start seeing my own worth, no one else would either. Linda hugged me before leaving, whispering, "Thank you for giving me my mother back." That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about all the women like Betty, like me, who had spent years shrinking themselves to fit into boxes other people had made for them. How many stories were lost because no one asked? How many dreams were abandoned because no one valued them? I made a decision. The next morning, I called Frank at the community center. Frank, what would you think about expanding our group? Not just for cooking, but for storytelling. Life stories. The kind of things people think no one wants to hear anymore. Marie, you brilliant woman, he said immediately. Do you know how many people come through here feeling invisible? Let's do it. Within a month, our Tuesday meetings had grown from 12 regulars to over 30. We started calling ourselves the Living History Society, and our format was simple. Each week, someone would spend 20 minutes sharing a story from their past. Not just the highlights, the ordinary moments that shaped who they became. Robert told us about translating for a peace negotiation between 2 countries whose names I can't mention even now. Sarah shared the story of discovering the manuscript that would become a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel in a box of books donated to her shop. Betty spoke about the night she sang at the Cotton Club while Martin Luther King Jr. sat in the audience. But the stories that moved me most were the quieter ones. Margaret telling us about the Victory Garden she'd maintained during World War II, how she'd fed half her neighborhood on vegetables grown in Brooklyn soil. James describing the precision required to repair the tiny mechanisms in watches, the meditation of working with his hands to bring time back to life. Dorothy sharing how she'd negotiated her way into a job at the telephone company in 1952 by showing up every day for a week until they hired her just to make her stop coming. These stories, I told them during one of our Tuesday morning coffees, they're treasures. How did we get to a place where being old means being irrelevant? Because youth stopped listening, and replied. And we stopped insisting they should. That spring brought another surprise. The local newspaper sent a reporter to write about our Living History Society. The article, titled "Brooklyn Seniors Refuse to be Forgotten," featured a photo of our group and quotes from several members about their experiences. But it was the paragraph about me that changed everything. Marie Dubois, 74, who organizes the group, says she was inspired to start the project after realizing that her own family had never shown interest in her childhood in Paris or her decades of experience in professional baking. I spent too many years waiting for people to ask about my life, she says. Now I ask people about theirs, and the stories are extraordinary. Within a week, that article had been shared online thousands of times. My phone started ringing with interview requests. A food blogger wanted to feature our French pastry collaboration with Hassan's family. A documentary filmmaker asked if she could attend our meetings. But the call that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Grand-mère? Tommy's voice was excited. I saw the newspaper story online. You're famous. Hardly fameux, mon chéri. Just visible. Mom showed it to all her friends. She said she never knew you did all those interesting things. I paused, processing this. Catherine was talking about me? Positively? What did she say exactly? She said she wished she'd asked you more questions when we were all together. Out of the mouths of babes. Even Catherine, in her own way, was beginning to understand what had been lost. Tommy, I said gently, it's never too late to ask questions. If she really wants to know about my life, she can call me herself. I think she's embarrassed. Well, embarrassment is the price we pay for treating people badly. But it doesn't have to be permanent. That conversation stayed with me for days. Was it possible that Catherine's cruelty had come from insecurity rather than malice? Did she mock my heritage because she felt threatened by it? Had she diminished my stories because she feared they were more interesting than her own? It didn't excuse the behavior, but it did help me understand it. And understanding, I was learning, was the first step toward healing. The documentary filmmaker, a young woman named Jessica, ended up spending 3 months with our group. She was fascinated by the idea of seniors reclaiming their voices, of elders refusing to be marginalized. What you've created here, she told me after filming several of our sessions, is revolutionary. You're not just preserving history, you're insisting that history includes you. The film, when it was completed, was more beautiful than I could have imagined. It followed several members of our group, intercutting their current lives with reenactments of their stories, archival footage, and interviews with family members who were learning about their loved ones for the first time. The section about me included footage of the bakery with Hassan's family, my hands working dough while I narrated stories of learning from my grandmère. There were shots of Montmartre with me as a voiceover, describing what it felt like to be a child in Paris during the 1950s. But the most powerful moment was when they interviewed Tommy. My grandmère is the most interesting person I know, he said seriously to the camera. She's lived in 2 countries and speaks 3 languages and can make food that tastes like magic. I don't understand why anyone wouldn't want to hear her stories. When the film was accepted into several documentary festivals, Jessica asked if I wanted to accompany her to the screenings. Me? I laughed. I'm not an actress or a filmmaker. Marie, you're the star. This film exists because of your courage to insist on being seen. And so, at 75, I found myself on red carpets, attending film festivals, being interviewed about ageism and family dynamics and the immigrant experience. It was surreal and wonderful and terrifying. But the best part was having Tommy with me at the New York premiere. He wore a suit and tie and introduced himself to everyone as Marie's grandson, with obvious pride. During the Q&A after the screening, a young woman in the audience asked, "What advice would you give to other seniors who feel invisible in their families?" I stood up slowly, looking out at the packed theater, and said, "Stop waiting for permission to matter. Stop making yourself smaller to fit into spaces that were never meant to accommodate your full self. Tell your stories, loudly, proudly, repeatedly if necessary. And if your family isn't interested, find people who are. The world needs your wisdom, your experience, your perspective. Don't take that gift to the grave unopened." The applause was thunderous, but what moved me most was seeing Tommy clapping hardest of all. After the screening, as we walked through the lobby, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the exit. Michael, looking uncertain but determined. "Mom," he said as we approached. I came. I hope that's okay." "Of course it's okay," I said, meaning it. He looked at Tommy, then back at me. I had no idea about any of it. "The documentary, the film festivals, you could have told me. You could have asked," I replied gently. He nodded, accepting the truth of that. "I watched the film. All of it. And I realized. I've spent my whole life seeing you as my mother, never as a person who existed before me and will exist after me. And now? Now I see both," he said. Can we have lunch this week? I have questions. So many questions." That lunch lasted 4 hours. Michael asked about my childhood, my parents, how I'd met his father, what my dreams had been before motherhood reshaped everything. He took notes on his phone, as if trying to capture decades of missed conversations in one afternoon. "I want to make this right," he said as we prepared to leave. "Not just between us, but for Tommy. I want him to grow up knowing his grandmother's stories, understanding where he comes from." "Then you'll have to listen," I said. "Really listen. Not just wait for your turn to talk, but actually hear what I'm saying." "I will," he promised. "I want to learn." That summer, Tommy and I finally took our trip to Paris. But this time, we weren't alone, Michael came too. 3 generations walking through Montmartre together, me showing them the building where I'd grown up, the cafe where I'd had my first coffee, the Seine where I'd made my promise to the Venus de Milo. "Grandmère," Tommy said as we stood at the top of the steps at Sacré-Cœur, looking out over the city, "I understand now why you never stopped talking about Paris. It's not just a place, it's part of who you are." "Yes," I said, tears in my eyes. "And now it's part of who you are too." Michael was quieter, but I could see he was processing everything. This city that had shaped his mother, these streets that had formed her dreams, this culture that had given her strength when she needed it most. "I'm sorry I never asked before," he said quietly as we sat at a cafe in the evening, watching the light fade over the rooftops. "You're asking now," I replied. "That's what matters." On our last night, we ate dinner at a small bistro near my childhood home. The owner, a man about my age, struck up a conversation when he heard my accent. "Vous êtes d'ici? You're from here?" "Oui," I smiled. "Born and raised in Montmartre." He launched into rapid French, asking about my neighborhood, my family, my story. Michael and Tommy listened, not understanding the words but clearly comprehending the warmth, the connection, the sense of belonging. He's inviting us back for Christmas, I translated. He says any daughter of Montmartre will always have family here. The belonging I felt in that moment, not just to Paris, but to myself, was worth every year I'd spent feeling lost. The documentary won several awards and aired on a major streaming platform. Suddenly, I was receiving messages from people all over the world, seniors who felt invisible, adult children who realized they'd never really known their parents, young people who wanted to hear more stories from their elders. The Living History Society became a model that community centers across the country started replicating. I began traveling to speak about the importance of intergenerational storytelling, of refusing to let age equal irrelevance. But perhaps the most meaningful change happened at home. Catherine called me in October. "Marie," she said, her voice small and uncertain, "I know I have no right to ask, but could we talk?" We met at a neutral cafe, both nervous, both carrying years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. "I saw the documentary," she began. "I had no idea about your life in Paris, your expertise, any of it. I feel horrible about how I treated you." "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. "What was it about me that threatened you so much?" She was quiet for a long time. "You were so sure of yourself," she finally said. "Even when you were trying to fit in, there was something solid about you. And I felt like such a fraud all the time. My French wasn't as good as I pretended. My sophistication was all surface. I think I attacked you because you represented something authentic that I was afraid I'd never be." It was an honest answer, more honest than I'd expected. "Catherine," I said gently, "insecurity is not an excuse for cruelty. But it is an explanation. And I appreciate you sharing it." "I want to make amends," she said. "I don't know how, but I want to try." "The person you need to make amends to most is Tommy," I told her. "He loves us both, and he's been caught in the middle of our drama for years. Whatever happens between you and me, he deserves better from both of us." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "You're right. And Marie, would you consider teaching me? About French cooking, I mean. The real kind, not the restaurant versions." It was a surprising request. "Why?" "Because I want to give Tommy something authentic to connect to. And because I want to understand what I was trying so hard to dismiss." We started small. Once a month, Catherine would come to my apartment for a cooking lesson. We made simple things at first, proper French onion soup, coq au vin, tarte tatin. She was a careful student, taking notes, asking questions about technique and tradition. Slowly, as we worked side by side in my small kitchen, some of the tension eased. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a kind of détente. An agreement to focus on what we both loved, Tommy, and to build from there. "You know," she said one afternoon as we waited for bread to rise, "I never understood why Michael talked about your cooking so much when he was younger. Now I get it. This isn't just food, it's culture, history, love all mixed together." "That's what cooking is supposed to be," I replied. "When it's done right." By Christmas of that year, we had achieved something I never thought possible, a functional family dynamic. Not perfect, not without its careful boundaries, but functional. Tommy spent Christmas Eve with me and Michael, learning to make bûche de Noël. Catherine joined us for Christmas dinner, bringing flowers and wine and genuine questions about my Christmas traditions in Paris. As we sat around my small table, the afternoon light filtering through my windows, I looked around at this complicated, imperfect, real family and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: contentment. "Grandmère," Tommy said as we finished dessert, "what was the best part of this year for you?" I considered the question seriously. The documentary, the film festivals, the recognition, the reconciliations, there had been so many meaningful moments. "The best part," I said finally, "was remembering that my story isn't over. That at 75, I can still surprise myself, still grow, still become more myself than I was before. I want to be like that when I'm old," Tommy declared. "Mon chéri," I laughed, "you don't have to wait until you're old. You can start being fully yourself right now." As I write this final section, I'm sitting in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning, waiting for Anne to arrive for our weekly coffee. The apartment smells like the pain of chocolate I made for tomorrow's senior center meeting. My calendar is full: a cooking class this afternoon, a storytelling session at the library on Thursday, a video call with a community center in Seattle that wants to start their own Living History Society chapter. At 76, my life has more purpose, more joy, more connection than it had at 66. I wake up excited about the day ahead. I go to sleep grateful for the life I've claimed. The mirror in my bathroom reflects a woman I finally recognize completely. Silver hair that catches the light, face lined with laughter and wisdom, eyes bright with curiosity about what comes next. This is what confidence looks like at 76. This is what it looks like to stop apologizing for taking up space. Michael calls every Sunday, full of questions about family history, recipes, stories he wants to preserve for Tommy. Catherine and I maintain our careful peace, united in our love for a boy who deserves better than the legacy of hurt we'd been building. Tommy, now 12, is fluent in French, passionate about cooking, and secure in his identity as the grandson of a woman who crossed an ocean for love and learned to bake miracles with her own hands. He talks about visiting Damascus with Hassan's family, about studying art in Paris, about all the stories he plans to collect from all the elders in his life. But my favorite moments are still the quiet ones. Tuesday mornings with and sharing memories and dreams like the sisters we were before life complicated everything. Friday afternoons at the bakery with Hassan's family, my hands in dough, surrounded by the warm chaos of a business built on love and shared heritage. Sunday evenings with my Living History Society friends, listening to stories that would otherwise be lost forever. These are the relationships that sustained me when blood family failed. These are the people who saw my worth when I had forgotten it myself. The girl who once promised herself she would never stop believing in beauty kept her word. The woman who crossed an ocean for love learned that sometimes the most important love to cultivate is the one you give yourself. The grandmère who deserved better finally figured out how to insist on it. I am Marie-Claire Dubois. I was born and raised on Croissants. I speak 3 languages, have lived on 2 continents, and have stories that could fill a library. I am a teacher, a friend, a mother, a grandmother. I am a woman who refused to disappear just because others stopped seeing me. And finally, at 76 years old, I know exactly who I am, and I am proud to be her. Have you ever lived, or known someone who lived, something like this? Where family dynamics made you feel invisible, where speaking another language became a weapon used against you, where age was treated as irrelevance rather than wisdom? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe. It means the world to me and helps ensure these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Sometimes the most important message is simply this: you are worth more than you're settling for, and it's never too late to start insisting on the respect you deserve.